Okay. All right. So this is my old friend Gus Bessalel, and
You guys,
he's spoken before. So pretty much everybody here is a sort of like a junior, maybe. And I've got a couple of freshmen that have joined us from my other class. So maybe just start off and tell us why you decided to write the book.
well, listen, writing a book is not an easy thing, so you had to have some real good motivation. I'd say I probably had two motivations. First of all, over the years, I've had a lot of people that I've worked with ask me questions about a lot of technical aspects, particularly entrepreneurial finance. And literally, every time they'd call me, I would spend an hour on the phone. And I said, okay, I have all these lessons to impart, and we sold our company about 1.5 years ago. And I said, all right, now's the time for me to start giving back. But I think the more important reason was that over the years, I've been doing startups for about 30 years. And you come to realize that the rules of startups are really written for the investors. They have the power often. And I've seen lots and lots of people who go into startups with the idea that, hey, I've got a piece of equity, I'm going to make a lot of money doing this. And then in the end, doesn't quite pan out the way that they thought. So, the whole reason I wrote the book was to give startup employees a more realistic understanding of what it means to go work for a startup, to do a self-inventory of why does it make sense for you to go into work for a startup. And then really to understand a lot of the technical aspects of, okay, I get this equity. What does it mean? What's it worth? What should I do with it? What happens when I leave? So if you look at the literature of entrepreneurship, most of it is written for startup founders and people who are actually trying to build the company. But there are, when I looked at the statistics, National Venture Capital Association says there are over 3.7 million people who work in venture-backed startups. That's in about 65 to 70,000 companies. So you've got founders that represent maybe 100, 150,000 people, and you've got 3.5+ million people who actually work in these companies. It's a much larger audience that I feel is completely underserved. So, if there had been books like this out there to educate the people who actually work in startups and not the founders, I wouldn't have bothered writing it.
So I pulled a few things off your book last night, and I'm just going to lob them up to you, and you can tell us about it. All right. So in the first, maybe it's in the preface, you say, one of the first lessons we learned at Harvard Business School was to gather as much data as possible to make decisions with the best information available. It was a running joke in class. When a professor asked students the first thing they would do in a situation that required a decision, the answer was always gather more information.
Right.
So I like that because we talk about that in this class a lot. The food subscription service folks, et cetera. You have a food subscription service product. Why did these 3 companies fail a few years ago? You need to know that information.
Sure.
So I guess you're saying this to help them prepare for their investor meeting, or what's this for?
Well, again, since the orientation of the book is mostly for people going to work in startups, I'll back up. I've had a number of potential and current startup employees read the book. I've had a number of founders read the book, and a number of VCs read the book, and they all take different things from the book. But my primary purpose in writing the book was to serve what we call the startup joiner audience, right? Not the people who found the company, but the people who go buy into the founder's vision and then join that company, right? So what I have observed as, both a founder and, someone who's hired a lot of people in my career, is that when people go to join a startup, they don't typically do a lot of due diligence. An opportunity comes across their desk and they say, wow, that sounds really interesting. Or they hear about a founder, or they want to go work in a particular sector or something. And they don't really do the kind of due diligence, let's say, that a venture capital firm has the ability to do. Right now, of course, the VCs have a lot more time, a lot more resources. They'll have analysts, they have access to investor reports, et cetera. But part of my advice to startup employees is try to gather as much information about the company you're going to work for as possible. And the reason is you're making an investment just like the VCs are making an investment, right? I mean, you're investing your time, your career, a few years of your life in, placing a bet on this company that you're going to work for. And what do you really know about them? So if you don't do your homework, you could end up in a situation where, you find out. I mean, I had an employee who left my company, went to work for another company, and a month later she called me up and said, "Hey, can I come back? Because I learned some things about this company I didn't really know going in, and maybe should have known." And fortunately, we were able to hire her back. That doesn't always happen. But doing as much due diligence as you can before you take that leap into a new company. And the same is true for founders. Obviously, study your market, study the competition, understand what's going to set you apart from what's already out there in the market. Understand why other companies who have tried to do what you're doing have failed. Maybe it was timing. Maybe, they missed something that the market wanted that they didn't understand. But again, my orientation was more for the employees. And it's hard because as an employee, you typically get an offer to join a company and you might have a week to give a response. You're in the interview process, you're sell, trying to get them to hire you. All of a sudden you get an offer. Now it's like the shoe's on the other foot. You're now the buyer, right? Should I buy this opportunity or should I look for something else? And what are you going to use to make that decision? And there's some frameworks in the book that you can think about, some due diligence checklists, and also just the nature of the offer. Is the offer fair? Is it, is it competitive with the market? Lots of things you need to understand as an employee. And I would argue, a lot of people take entrepreneurship courses because they want to, start a company, and that's great. But the chances are you're going to go work for startups before you actually start your first company. And so understanding what it is to be an employee and to pursue opportunities that make sense for you. And when I say for you, it's like, who are you? What value can you bring? What's the company looking for? How do those things fit? All that stuff is important.
Excellent. So I'm going to throw out some different titles of the different sections of your book, and then just kind of let you pick and choose how you'd like to talk about them. So the cast in order of appearance.
Okay.
What does that mean?
Yeah. So in one of the chapters of the book, I sort of talk about, going to a play. And I think this ties into what we were just talking about, which is, a lot of people go to a play and they, as soon as you walk in, they hand you the playbill, right? It's got all kinds of information in it, who the actors are, the cast, maybe it's background on the play, the writer, the composer if it's a musical. And a lot of people just show up and just kind of, put the playbill on the floor and just wait for the action to come. But the more you can understand about the show, the script, the actors, the characters, the more you're going to probably take away from that show. And so when I talk about the cast, and specifically in order of appearance, when you think about a startup, you got a founder, right, sitting on stage by themselves, or maybe a couple of co-founders, little spotlight on them right there in their garage. They're, in their bedroom at home. They're trying to figure out, like, okay, can I make this thing work? And then a whole series of other people start to come in to the picture, right? Maybe they hire an early employee. Maybe they have other, advisors, seasoned executives that they know, maybe a family member or an uncle, a friend. The more people who start to come in, come onto the stage as you're building your startup, the more complexity is created in that venture, right? And in the end, the book is really around, it's about venture-backed startups, because there's unique dynamics. When you bring a venture capitalist or investors of any sort into your company, they have certain demands. They have expectations about, how quickly you're going to return money. They get, governance rights. So the more you understand about each one of these characters, and the characters will include, you as a founder, your employees, your advisors, your investors, the board members, all of those people have their own agendas. They have their own sort of influence that they're going to have on the company, right? And so if you don't understand kind of where they're coming from, what their background is, what their objectives are, it's harder to manage all these constituencies to try to achieve success in the business. And the thing is, again, looking at it from the perspective of an employee, most employees are sort of insulated from the board dynamics, from what happens with the VCs. But those decisions that are happening at that level have an impact on you as an employee, because they determine the success of that company. Is it going to get more funding? Is it going to achieve an exit? Are the venture capitalists basically, going to say, you know what, we're going to stop investing in this company because it's not making enough progress? Often as an employee, and I'm talking about people who are kind of, your line sort of developers or marketing folks or whatever, you're not really privy to those conversations that are happening. So you have to kind of intuit a lot of stuff that's happening in the company behind the scenes.
Excellent. You have a whole section called the proof continuum.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So there's a kind of a general arc that startups will follow from, concept to ultimate success and exit. And I try to codify that. I actually learned, I was sort of educated to this, what I call the proof continuum. He didn't call it that, but by a friend of mine who's the, 6-time CFO, took 3 companies public. And he said, as you're building a company, you have to move through different stages. And they're kind of milestones. And particularly in venture-backed companies, you've got to move through those milestones pretty quickly, because the investors are going to expect you to achieve results. And if you're stalled, they may start imposing restrictions on the company. They may force you to lay people off. They may cut your budget. Like I said before, they may decide to stop investing. So there's essentially a continuum of these milestones, and it starts with, and I'll use, technology companies as kind of the, the framework. You have a technology that you've built. Oftentimes you got a technical founder who has some idea for solving some particular issue. They're going to build a prototype. They're going to try to prove out the technology. So the first stage is, does your technology work? That's great if you can get your technology to work, but you have to also turn it into a product, right? Technology for its own sake is not all that useful. It has to be productized so that people are actually willing to pay for it. And early on in a company's life, the people who will generally try and pay for your product often are people that, the founders or early employees have relationships with, or maybe your advisors know. But to have a successful business, you have to be able to sell to people you don't know. So you start with the technology, prove out your technology, prove that you have a product that somebody's willing to pay for, prove that you can sell it to people you don't know. So repeatability of that sale, right? You want to be really successful, you have to scale the business. So putting all the elements in place to allow a business to grow rapidly and not kind of, fold in on itself because you're unable to service your customers, right? And then you sort of keep going from scalability to profitability to positive cash flow, right? So in the book, there's 7 stages of what I call the proof continuum. And as a startup founder and as somebody who is going to go work in a company, you need to understand, where is the company along that continuum, right? Because at every stage of the continuum, you need different resources, you need different skills, right? As you get to the stage of, okay, I've got a product now and I'm trying to scale that product, I need more sales and marketing resources, right? Early on, maybe what you really need is product management and engineering. Somebody who can go out to the market, understand what the market is looking for, translate that back to the development team so that they can actually build the product in such a way that it's going to be attractive to prospective customers. So, this goes back to a little bit of what I was saying about, as an employee, understanding what you bring, what's valuable, what could be valuable to a company, also fits within the context of the proof continuum, right? Because there are some people, and I would count myself as one of them, who fit better at the very earliest stages of a company. When there's not a lot of structure, you're dealing with a lot of sort of uncertainty, lots of different decisions need to be made, right? And then there are people who are more suited to kind of later stage companies where there's more structure, There's, the product is already established in the market, and what you're really trying to do is grow that really rapidly. Okay, the company's more institutional. The job, characteristics tend to be a little narrower and more defined. So I use the analogy of kind of athletes and position players, right? In the beginning, you need people who are just really kind of good athletes, that they can throw themselves in a lot of different situations. They may not be the best at any given thing that they're doing, but they're good enough to help the company move forward. As the company matures, you can afford, and the companies will tend to hire people with specific skill sets to fill specific roles. So again, taking an inventory of who you are and how you fit will help you decide, okay, am I suited for a company where there's basically two co-founders and 2 employees, and I'm going to be employee number 3? Or am I better off being at that, 40 or 50 person company where my role is more defined, and I feel like I've got the foundation of being able to be a productive member of that organization.
I have a gift for you. It's a water bottle. We could fill it up with water and give it to you right now.
Yeah, sure. Should have brought one.
Can somebody actually, let's not do that. There's a sink back there. Can somebody grab him a glass of water from the sink back there in like a paper cup? And
Thank you, guys.
Yeah. Thanks, Danny. So we did talk about at the beginning of the semester that entrepreneurs, I call it, like half jokingly saying, it's a genetic defect that we are kind of never satisfied. So the proof continuum made me think of that, where you could have 5 million in revenue, but like as entrepreneurs, we're always thinking, yeah, but I should have 10.
Right.
And I have 8 features on my product, but it really needs 10. And you're never satisfied, which is unfortunate, but you can't, for some reasons, but for other reasons, it's actually effective. It's our superpower in some ways.
Yeah.
But we did talk to the students about, is a startup right for you?
Yeah.
Thanks, Danny.
Thank you.
So, and I do agree that, at least in my career, I didn't start my own thing until I worked at a lot of companies along the way. So they'll figure that out. But what do you say in your book about whether a startup is right for you? How do you make them think about that?
Well, I start by sort of talking about expectations, right? I mean, we've all grown up with, parents and uncles and aunts and peers who kind of make the assumption, you're going to get good grades, you're going to go to college, you're going to come out, you're going to, find a successful career track. And that's the sort of, traditional view of how you pursue your career. And, I started my career at Bain & Company. So I don't know if you guys have heard of Bain & Company, but it's, it's one of the major management consulting firms. And, when I would walk around and say I work at Bain, there was this kind of like this, oh yeah, we know what Bain is. It's this sort of prestigious organization. There's a shorthand, right? You work for Microsoft, you work for Meta, whatever, any big company, people sort of intuitively already get that. So going to work for a startup is like, you're kind of out there on the frontier. Chances are most people have never heard of the company you're working for, especially if it's pretty early stage. So there's a bit of an ego question in terms of, is that cool with you? Like, are you all right being, and I think working in startups has become far more, let's say, acceptable, even cool in this, in the last, 15 years. But there's still this sense of, okay, I still have to explain myself. Why didn't I take that, consulting job that's going to pay me, $110,000, $120,000? I'm going to go work for the startup, which can't really afford to pay me a salary right now. So I'm doing it on the come. The other, aspects of startups is they tend to be very unstructured. In big companies, you get defined jobs, you have established HR policies and performance criteria, and managers that are held accountable to, did they do your performance review, and you've got established bonuses. There's just a lot of structure. Startups are basically the exact opposite of that, right? I mean, everybody's scrambling to build the product and try to get customers, right? And most startup founders that I've encountered have never run a company before. And they're, let's say they're great technologists. They don't know anything about HR. They don't know anything about back office administration. They don't know anything about any of that stuff. And to them, that's low priority, right? So you're going to work in an environment where it's going to feel like, hey, there are not really a lot of guardrails. I come into work, not 100% sure what I'm doing today. I have, some goals, but nobody's really, actively giving me feedback or holding me accountable. So you have to be a self-starter to work in that kind of an environment. And in fact, the people who are sort of more proactive about looking for ways that they can apply their skills in areas that are beyond, let's say, their narrow theoretical job description, those kind of people will thrive in a startup. If you're in a startup and you're like, no, this is my job, and I'm only going to function, I'm only going to do what I'm told, that's not going to be necessarily all that effective, right? I think the other thing about startups and the book is it's supposed to be educational, but it's also a little bit cautionary in the sense that startups come with a lot of risk. So if you join a startup, what I want people to understand is that there is a lot of risk. There is a high failure rate in startups, right? Statistics will vary, but anywhere from 70 to 90% of startups ultimately don't make it. Or they may bump along, but they may not make it at a level where your equity as an employee becomes worth a lot, right? So you have to start to look at that and say, well, why am I doing this? And if you're doing it because you have, a love of the mission of the company, and you're going to be working with some great people and probably getting access to senior management in a way that you wouldn't get in a company, that's all great. If you're looking at, and I called the book the Startup Lottery for a reason, because lotteries have very low odds of winning. So if you're going into a startup and think, hey, I'm going to, become a millionaire or more, it's possible, but it's not likely, especially if you're not, a C-suite or VP level executive. So what I'm trying to do is encourage people to think both from the inside out, right? Who are you? What do you want? What are you trying to accomplish in your career? And how does this opportunity working for this unknown, unstructured, risky venture, how is that going to fit, right, in your sort of life plan, right? So I talk about in the book a concept that it's called the career thesis. If you look at most venture capital firms, they tend to have an investment strategy or an investment thesis about what sectors they're going to invest in, maybe geographies, maybe what stage of company they're going to invest in, right? Are they doing really early stage or growth stage? And so what I'm trying to do is encourage the readers, you guys, the next generation of startup joiners and founders, to think about, what is your career thesis? What sector do you want to be in? Where do you want to be in? Where do you fit in terms of the stages of companies, right? What skills do you bring to the table? How can you build on those skills to ultimately get to your, the destination you want in your career? And I think big companies, well-run big companies, are very good at workforce development. I just coincidentally, my daughter works for LinkedIn in the LinkedIn Learning Group. That's what they do. Most of their customers are large corporations who provide professional development resources to their staff. Very few startups have the resources to be able to do that, and they're not even really thinking about that, right? Everybody's just running flat out. So it's on you to figure out, how do you keep progressing in your capabilities, so that you can be more valuable to your companies over time.
So kind of off my my menu here, off my script, the students read an article called E-Myth, and it's about the myth of who usually starts a company? Is it a technologist usually? Or is it, so they divide the types of people that usually are in companies into three groups. There's the technologist, the entrepreneur, and the manager. So, we talk about Microsoft, where we'll say Paul Allen was the technologist, Bill Gates was the entrepreneur, and Ballmer was the manager. So number one, do you feel like, in your experience, that is how you would categorize those types of people? But then also, do you feel like it's often technology people without the ability to sort of commercialize a product? Are they usually the people that are starting companies? Because my experience is not that. My experience is that entrepreneurs like you and I, who know enough about technology to be dangerous, can hire the technologist and the other people, but the article talks about how in their belief or their experience, it's usually technologist.
Well, I think so. The answer is yes, yes, and yes, right? I mean, basically, it depends. I would say it depends on the sector you're in, the kind of problem you're trying to solve. Some problems are not obvious. Some, especially deeply technical problems, are not obvious to non-technical people, right? So the last company I was involved in was a cloud security company, and it was started by a technologist because he was in and around this, distributed systems space. He saw cloud starting to become, a prevalent way that people would do their computing. And he basically said, okay, everybody's running to the cloud, but nobody's paying attention to security, right? They're going to the cloud because it's agile, it's fast, you don't have to invest a lot in equipment. I can just pay for computing as I go. But, his perspective was, everybody's looking at this from a financial perspective, but they're not looking at it holistically in terms of security. And ultimately, we're going to have a lot of problems. I would have never come up with that. I mean, as an entrepreneur, I would have never seen that. And his approach to the business was, because I had worked with him in a company before, to call me, right? So I think it's the reverse of what you said, which is the entrepreneur starts the company and then goes and hires the talent. His approach was to say, there's a business here, but I'm not a business person. So I need somebody who's going to help me understand the business side. So I think it cuts both ways.
Do you find that more common than not? Because I think the article does say that it's usually a technologist that starts a company.
I think if you, it depends on how you define startup, right? I mean, in the book, because I'm talking mostly about venture-backed startups, I tend to more narrowly define them as startups that are, underpinned by technology. So I would say in that context, it tends to be more of a technical founder who starts it because they're deeply embedded in a given space. They see the problems and they're able to sort of identify a gap. But I can't definitively say. I tend to think less the manager is going to start a business than it's going to be the entrepreneur or the technologist, right? The manager is generally somebody who comes in later to help impose order on the chaos, right? Because early stage ventures have a lot of chaos in it.
Excellent. Actually, I do have more questions, but I'll pause here and ask you guys if you have any questions for Gus. Albert?
Hey, Gus.
Hey.
Earlier on, you mentioned, I believe, is the problem continuum?
Proof
Continuum.
Right.
And you mentioned one important aspect is for the individual to really look within themselves and see what value can bring to the table.
Yeah.
And for yourself personally, and maybe in the book too, how do you advise college students or early career adults? How do they really look within themselves and map out, these are my strengths, these are my weaknesses? Is it as simple as one day meditation reflection? How do you really know what you're good at and what you can?
Well, I mean, I'd say really early in your career, it's a little bit of a trial and error, right? I do think that if you if you have specific technical skills, oftentimes you can slot into a company at various stages. So if you're a coder, right, there's often a lot of need for coders. If you come with a finance degree, chances are there's going to be a specific spot for you. One of the challenges of working in a startup is because there isn't a lot of training and there isn't, a lot of structure. I think part of thinking about where you fit along the continuum is to really think about what is your work style, how much supervision and structure do you need? Are you somebody who's kind of a self-starter, right? Are you someone who can be thrown into a lot of different situations and you'll find yourself, okay, today my manager asked me to go do some marketing analysis, and tomorrow I got to support the sales force. And, then they said, well, go and, research the competitive landscape. Like, if you are the kind of person who likes to do a whole variety of things, that probably suggests you're going to be fine within an earlier stage venture. If you're someone who has very narrow, like, I hired a controller in my company. She's like, I just want to focus on the accounting and the tax. Don't talk to me about anything else. Like, I don't want to talk to investors. That's your job as a CFO. You go talk to them, right? Well, the company has to be big enough where you can start to slice and dice those kind of roles. And so if you have a specific kind of skill set, you're going to probably end up in a larger company, or maybe a slightly farther along on the growth curve. Because what's true of the earliest stage ventures is you really often don't know what you're working on from day to day, week to week. The problems that come up are very different. And the founders and other, leaders are just going to grab resources wherever they can and throw you at the problem. And you have to be willing to be thrown at problems that you're like, yeah, I don't really know how to do this, but I'm going to go figure it out. So I don't know if I can answer it more, kind of more specifically than that.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Brennan speaking. Maybe a question in terms of when to bring in a more structured process in the startups. When do you think it makes sense to kind of go from every scrambling to get customers to the product out there to, hey, we need to have proper controlling, proper accounting, proper investor relations. When
well, let's just say, as someone who's been doing this for 30 years, I would say as soon as possible, right? But you have to recognize that there's a trade-off in terms of, investment of resources. So if you're pre-funding, you're probably not going to be worrying about a lot of that stuff, right? I always tried to look at decisions we were making and investments we were making through the lens of, is this a good use of my investor's capital? Right? If I had to stand in front of the investor and say, we spent this money on a, $25,000 accounting system, and they're gonna be like, why do you need that? You don't even have any customers. You guys can run spreadsheets for now. And when you get more scale of transactions, we'll worry about that. So the good news is, I think in this world, there's a lot of ways to approach solving problems, solving staffing problems, right? Solving, I need systems. You can outsource. I mean, for the first 2 years of my last company, we just hired an outsourced bookkeeper from an accounting firm. And she was probably working on the company 5 hours a week, 7 hours a week, right? I didn't need to hire that person into the company. So once you bring in investors, now all of a sudden there's an expectation that your processes start to get buttoned down, because they're going to want to know how you're spending the money, how you're budgeting, right? They're going to often have approval rights on your annual operating plan, right? And you need to report back to them. Well, if you don't have good systems, and the same is true of any other discipline, because I was CFO, I tend to think about this from the kind of financial administrative side, but there's the other side too, which is you've got product development, you know, how are you connecting the dots between product management and your engineering team in the beginning, right? What structures and processes have you put in place? Because when you show up to that monthly or quarterly board meeting, the board is going to be intensely interested in what kind of progress you're making. And you need to be able to kind of succinctly and clearly report to those people saying, yeah, we've set these development priorities. We're, 80% along this one, and here's the delivery date, and here's the delivery dates on this one, and here's what we're hearing from prospective customers. So when I say as early as possible is a trade-off. You're running flat out, and when the company is 5 or 7 people and everybody's sitting in the same room, you're all talking to each other. There's no information gap, right? Everybody knows what everybody's doing. As soon as you start to grow, which is often accompanied by having brought capital in, because that's how you can afford to build the team, right? Then you have to think about how do you connect the dots across the organization and then outside the organization to your other constituencies.
So the students just turned in a first version of their pro forma, and they have not necessarily worked with these types of documents before. But I'm just going to throw this out there, and you tell me, without showing you what was on their pro formas, I want to just kind of get your knee-jerk reaction to what an investor, what are red flags for an investor when they're looking at pro formas. So could be, the hockey curve revenue growth, number of units sold per month. So the whole bottom up approach versus top down, but operating expenses, including salaries, how much are you spending on marketing before you've even opened the doors, capital expenditures, cash on hand.
Yeah.
What kind of grabs you, since you have been a CFO, but you've also you're also angel investor as well. So like, what tips would you give them on pro formas?
Well, first thing I'd say is no matter what pro forma you put together, you're going to find out it's wrong. So it's really, the pro forma is, to me, is more about the thought process. I'll say from my experience, it's very easy to, or relatively easy, not always, but it's relatively easy to model and project costs. It's extremely difficult to model and project revenues. So, the revenue side of the equation is really driven by your assumptions. Are your assumptions realistic? And the nature of the assumptions is really a kind of a window on your thought process. So as an investor, I want to understand what's your thought process around how you derive these numbers. I mean, I don't personally get too caught up in how much people are going to, okay, my 5-year revenue is going to be $37 million. I'm like, yeah, I don't put any stock in any of that, right? I look at it and think, is it a big space, right? And is there a need for the product?
And are they the right team?
And right, the team is critical, but in terms of the numbers to me are more an indication of how well the team has thought through the business model and the kind of things that they're going to need to do to work their way through the proof continuum. So, the reason I like the proof continuum is because it sort of breaks down the journey into a series of sub milestones, right? So the 7 steps of the proof continuum, each one is a kind of a little opportunity to create a plan to achieve that milestone, right? So if you think about it, it's like, okay, I'm going to invest in you as a company. What are you doing with those resources to get to the next milestone? Because when you get to the next milestone, then you're likely in a position to get somebody to write the next check into the company, and then the next check, and the next check. If you stall at any one of those points, right, that's when things start to unravel. So, you know, let's just, and I don't know how long your pro formas are. I always thought that anything longer than a 12-month plan was essentially useless in my view, right? Because you're going to act on a 12-month plan. You're not acting on your 3-year plan or your 5-year plan. You're acting on your 1-year plan. That's your budget. That's where you're spending money this month and next quarter, right? Because before you get to year 2 and 3 and year 4, you're going to rewrite that annual operating plan based on what's happened leading up to that planning process, that budgeting process, right? So the investors always want to see a 3-year or 5-year plan, but as far as I'm concerned, you know, I never pay that much attention to those because I don't think they have that much value.
And how do investors view the top-down approach? Like, you know, the hospitality industry is a $150 billion industry, so you should be excited about coming in, investing in a company like ours because we're going to disrupt that industry or whatever, versus bottom up. Which would you give more weight to as an investor?
Well, I think the top down is sort of a gating item, right? It's like, okay, is the market big enough that there is an opportunity for somebody to come in and build a, you know, big company in that space? So it's kind of like a litmus test, but it's not what's going to necessarily get, you know, an investor. In my view, most investors are not going to invest just based on the fact that you say, hey, I'm going after this big market. You know, the bottom up approach to me goes back to what I was just saying, which is it's a more kind of robust and nuanced indication of how has the team really thought about things like go to market or what, you know, product features need to be built, et cetera. And, you know, again, because, you know, I'll use the analogy. My son was a college golfer, right? You don't stand on the first tee and say, I'm going to shoot a 69 today. You hit every shot and then it adds up to the final score. And that's the same thing in a startup. You come in, you execute every day, right? And execution is a bottom-up exercise. What are we working towards today? What plans, you know, I don't know if you guys talked about OKRs at all. Okay, so one of my favorite planning tools is something called OKRs. You guys should all look it up. There's a great book by John Doerr, who's one of the, you know, the kind of legendary venture capitalists, and it's called Measure What Matters. But OKRs is a planning tool where you essentially set big objectives, but then you break those objectives down into what are called key results. So objectives, O, key results, KR, OKRs. So the objectives can be 12-month, 24-month, 36-month, kind of big, lofty goals that you're trying to go after. But the key results are the things that you need to do this month, this quarter, this year to get to those objectives. So it sort of combines the top down and the bottom up, right? You look at the big objectives, that's your sort of top down. What are we really trying to do as a company? You know, what's our mission? You know, what are we trying to get to in terms of top line revenue? But the KRs are the steps and the interim milestones that you have to use to get there day in and day out. So you need both. You need the top down, you need the big picture, but you need the bottom up to figure out what steps am I going to take to actually get to those goals.
So I'll have to check out OKRs. I mean, I obviously know John Doerr's, but I have not heard of that.
Yeah, we use them in our last company, and it really is, it's kind of a galvanizing. I mean, there are other planning approaches that you can use, but it was an incredibly effective organizing tool for getting the management team all together on the same page.
So when I think of business books that all business students should read, and in many cases, professors who have written books and sort of hit the jackpot, and I hope your book is one of them. But I'm kind of thinking like Proof Continuum. I'm thinking like that alone could be like,
yeah, no, I know. I was thinking about that. If I want to write the next one, that could be it.
Yeah, it's kind of catchy. But, you know, Porter's five forces, huge.
Right.
Everybody's got to know that. But we rely a lot on the lean startup methodology.
Okay.
So, you know, when I was doing my startups, I don't think I knew the name lean startup methodology, but without prompting you even more than that and give me like the details of what we talk about, like what is your understanding of the lean startup methodology, and how important would you say it is for startups?
Well, I think it's critical. You know, there's a whole idea of sort of fail fast, right? I mean, try, iterate, learn, adjust, and, you know, particularly in a technology company, you can spend a lot of time going down massive rabbit holes that burn huge amounts of cash and time. You know, the one thing about venture-backed companies is that, you know, investors in the venture space don't tend to be that patient, right? Because especially if you're in technology, because technology moves really, really fast. So you can't afford to, you know, one of the challenges that we had in our last company, we were an engineering-led company that was not as market focused as it should have been in the early days. So we spent a lot of time and a lot of money building stuff that we thought the market was going to care about, that it not only didn't care about, but kind of rejected it, right? And in a way, we were lucky because we raised a ton of capital, which is both a blessing and a curse. Had we had to be more kind of, you know, bootstrapped about the way we did things, you know, had we not had years of runway, we would have had to be much more disciplined about the way that we linked what engineering was doing with the market.
So one of the keys to lean startup, as you know, is to talk to customers as quickly as possible.
Right.
Where we sort of instead sometimes drink our own Kool-Aid.
It's a tough one, I think, because in a truly innovative company, sometimes, and this is, you know, I think this was the case in our company, is that our founder saw in some ways the future of where cloud was going 5 or 7 years before the market really started to understand it. So as we would talk to customers, you know, on the one hand, yes, you want to listen to customers, but on the other hand, if you're doing something really innovative, those customers aren't necessarily going to be telling you to do that because they don't even know that that might exist, right? They haven't even thought about that.
We've used that example with Steve Jobs didn't believe in focus groups because if people asked, what's the next step of computers, they didn't know that you could actually swipe.
Right, right. I mean, right. I was involved in a company probably, I don't know, 12, 13 years ago that wanted to bring a new service into office buildings. And so there was a company that had concierges in the office building. You say, we're going to bring the new service in, and you talk to the concierge company and they say, well, nobody's asking for that. Well, they're not asking for that because it doesn't exist. If they knew it existed, they might ask for it. Unless you introduce it to them, they're not going to know to ask for it. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg, right? So part of the issue, and I mean, focus groups, you know, individual customer interactions, betas, alphas, like all those different ways that you can work with customers. The test and iterate approach, you know, put a you know, minimum viable product out, find some friendlies to test it, give you feedback. You know, again, this comes back to the early sales in a company are often to people that you know. Are they willing to essentially take this thing that you've, you know, sort of strapped together with rubber bands and glue because it's not fully formed as a product? Are they willing to take it, test it, give you feedback, tell you what they want? They may not have thought about the fact that this is a thing that the market might need, but are they willing to, you know, engage with you over, you know, a 2-month trial or 3-month trial and give you feedback? So yeah, no, I mean, I think it's critical. And the way we turned our company around, and you know, Philip Merrick, yeah. So we brought a new CEO into the company And, you know, if I were to tell you guys one critical thing about building your companies is that I think, particularly in the early stages, product management is the most critical function in a company, right? It is the thing that connects the market to what you're building. And we didn't really have a good product management DNA in the company until we brought a new CEO in who had, you know, built a company that had $1 billion valuation. And he basically said, you know, I mean, 6 months after he got there, he's like, you know, you're going after the wrong markets with the wrong product. We have great technology, but we got to focus it in a different direction.
In the books, they call that product market fit.
Right. Finding product market fit, and the discipline that gets you there is product management.
Right. Excellent. Questions?
I think there's a Henry Ford quotation of focus groups where he said, if I ask people what they want, they say they want a faster horse. So
Right,
to your
right.
point.
Fair. Yeah.
I'm curious, of course, being with VC and the technology, you know, them being really on that timetable, do you feel like from, you know, but a lot of most successful companies, they're really rejected by VC for this VC want to accelerate it. And then we see that the macro forces with, you know, being more difficult, finding higher valuation, you know, companies which might have really been very capital intensive are now trying to be even leaner. So I'm thinking, looking at those climates and looking at the way that VC is treating it, if you were starting start today and we're trying to navigate the VC landscape, like how do you think you manage that dynamic about those increasing pressures?
Well, I mean, there's a lot in that question. So first of all, I think the VC landscape today is a little different from what it was even, you know, 18 months ago, 12 months ago. I mean, you know, and very different from when we were raising money for my last company, which was, you know, probably 6, 7, 8. We raised the bulk of our capital between 2013 and 2018. So much of your interaction with venture capitalists depends on what space you're in and who the team is, what kind of track record they have. So I'll give you an example. Our CEO from my last company went off and became a co-founder of a new company and raised $2.5 million with no product, an idea and a team, a very, you know, accomplished technical co-founder. But the two of them have had such a good track record that they could go to their VC buddies for whom they had made tons of money in the past and say, we're doing this thing, will you guys come in at the seed stage? And they raised $2.5 million and it was quick, right? That is the exception. Right now, most VCs are not coming into companies unless you already have a certain amount of traction. You got a product, you may have some early customers or at least some early trials going, or, you know, a lot of people engaging with your product, right? So I was just engaging with someone yesterday on LinkedIn who was, you know, expounding the virtues of bootstrapping. In other words, spend as little money as you can, get as far as you can before you try to engage with VCs, because you're going to waste a lot of time talking to VCs who will literally say to you, yeah, your idea sounds great. Come back when you have accomplished X, Y, or Z, right? And honestly, as investors, I think that is the right thing to do. I think when people throw tons of money, I mean, the AI space is kind of insane right now with the amount of money that people are throwing at it. And, you know, the vast majority of those companies are going to fail, right? As in most hot spaces, you get this sort of lemming effect. You get, you know, VCs funding hundreds of companies, and eventually there will be, you know, a big winnowing and a few companies, you know, look, there'll be targeted sector AI applications, but, you know, but the big winners are going to be a few companies. And all those VCs who got in early and didn't have, you know, invested in companies that didn't have any traction, you know, they're going to have to explain to their limited partners later why they were so dumb. to put money in these companies, right? So I think a more disciplined approach among the VCs makes sense, but as a founder, as a company builder, that means you have to go farther with less. And by the way, the valuations have all come down as well, so your expectations are also have to be managed, you know? So, you know, the idea that some VC is going to write you a check because of something you wrote on the back of a napkin right now, probably not going to happen. I don't know if that answered your question, because there was a lot in your question.
Go ahead, we only have 2 minutes left.
I was curious, just sort of based off this question, what have you noticed with startup founders that have failed maybe at their initial company?
Mhm.
Have you noticed a shift? Are they right onto like the next idea, or do they shift more into more of like a corporate America? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I actually talk about that in the book.
Yeah.
One of the things I talk about in the book is when is the right time to join a startup, right? So, and I have this kind of framework, which is certainly not empirically proven, but I call it the U curve of risk, right? So at your guys' age, you know, in your stage of your careers or when you come out of college, you don't really have a whole lot to lose. You know, you could take a flyer on something, and if it fails, you know, just go get a job, figure out something else. I think that to answer your question, it depends on, I'll say two things. Number one, coming up with a startup idea is not that easy. So just because you started one company doesn't mean you have an idea for something else that's viable, right? I mean, you know, startup ideas are kind of once in a blue moon. You know, something hits you and then you get passionate, it becomes your mission. And if it doesn't work, it's not like, oh yeah, I had four other ideas in my back pocket, right? Secondly, and I'll talk about my own personal example. I mean, when I started my first company,
We don't have a lot of time because I have to go to our next class.
okay. When I started my first company, I put my life savings into it. Had it not worked, I would have had no choice but to go get a job. And I think a lot of people will find, and a lot of people that I've seen, founders, end up in that situation. If their startup doesn't work, they're unable to get funded or whatever, they can't pay their bills, they have to go get a job because they have to survive. Startup life is great, but you got to pay your bills.
All right, well, thank you, Gus, for being here with us. Hopefully you guys know the
All right, thank you.
He can probably stay for a few minutes if you guys have any specific questions.
Yes, absolutely.